Hello everyone! Last time out we had a really formal discussion of Mr. Mouse's choices. We thought he was quite keen on that and that helped him think through what he was going to do. But then he went and watched some of our other videos. He had a look at the investment video in particular and he saw that uncertainty influenced choices. And he got a bit worried. Uncertainty and risk seemed to be involved with the world changing. So if the world changed around him, would he need to change his choices? Would he end up regretting what he has done? So before spending his dollar, he wants us to go and explain how changes could affect his choice. And to do that, we're going to use the same formal tools. Now, I want a good economist to get us through this, so I brought along Golnara to take us on this ride. Over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go. Before making his choice, Mr. Mouse wants to think about potential changes in his circumstance, in case they influence his choice. What can I say? Mr. Mouse is a very nervous sort of guy who likes to overthink everything, so like Matty.
Oi.
To think about change, we need to go back to thinking about Mr. Mouse's budget constraint and the related opportunity cost. So let's pull that up. Here Mr. Mouse is still trying to make a decision about whether to buy apples or cheese. As we noted last time around, the option he has to choose from depend on the money income he has available and the price of each product. This gives us the budget constraint. The area below, and including the budget constraint, is what we term the opportunity set for Mr. Mouse. This is what an economist views as his real income, as it constitutes all the different bundles of apples and cheese that Mr. Mouse could decide to consume. If Mr. Mouse has no intention to save, no interest in other products, or if we have removed his desire for other things from his money income already, then we would expect Mr. Mouse to pick a point on the budget constraint, as otherwise he's sacrificing apples and or cheese for nothing. The question then is, how do changes in income and prices influence these opportunities? Let's start with the situation where Mr. Mouse has lost some of his income. For example, he may have accidentally purchased a haircut for 50 cents, leaving him with only 50 cents for apples and cheese slices. Like last video, the price of apples is 5 cents and the price of cheese is 10 cents. With $1 of income, he could have purchased 20 apples, the top of the vertical axis, or 10 cheese slices, the horizontal axis. But after losing half of his income, he can now only decide to buy up to 10 apples or 5 cheese slices. Because of this, the budget constraint moves back in a parallel manner, representing the fact that for every amount of cheese purchased, Mr. Mouse can buy 10 fewer apples. The monetary trade-off between apples and cheese is the same as before, the relative price, but he simply has less income to consume apples and cheese. Okay, well, what happens if Mr. Mouse keeps his dollar coin, but instead the price of cheese doubles to 20 cents? How do you think this works, Matty?
Thanks, Golnara. In this case, the budget constraint changes with a pivot in this following way. Now, why is that? If Mr. Mouse only purchased apples, then more expensive cheese doesn't change a damn thing. He can still buy 20 apples. However, for each cheese slice purchased, more apples now need to be sacrificed. Specifically, he would have to stop buying 4 apples to save up enough money to buy a cheese slice, compared to the 2 apples he would have needed to sacrifice before. In other words, the relative price of cheese is now higher. If all he buys is cheese, he can now only buy 5 cheese slices, which is why we see the situation where he only buys cheese as having the biggest gap between the old budget constraint and the new one. Now, although this is different from a change in money income, we can see that the opportunity set to choose from is smaller, just like it is when money income falls. So to an economist, this is still a reduction in real incomes, but it is due to an increase in a price rather than a reduction in money income itself. This brings us to actually thinking about the choice that Mr. Mouse might make given these changes in the opportunity set. Gulnara, can you take us through how a change in income, what you described before, will change Mr. Mouse's actual choices?
Sure thing, Matt. Here we have a budget constraint and we want to figure out Mr. Mouse's choice. So there it is. This tells us the number of apples and cheese slices he will buy, given his income and the price of apples and cheese. Now, what happens if all prices double and his money income doubles as he finds another coin? Well, nothing. The curve stays where it is. Why? Because apples cost 10 cents, cheese costs 20 cents, and Mr. Mouse has $2. On the vertical axis, he can buy 20 apples, and on the horizontal axis, he can buy 10 cheese slices, just like before. What about if no prices change, but Mr. Mouse finds a coin? Well, with $2, a price of apples at 5 cents, and a price of cheese slices at 10 cents, Mr. Mouse can now buy double the apples or cheese, so the budget constraints shifts out. Now, we can't tell what he will consume following this, but we can rule out some stuff. Let's look at this budget constraint relative to the initial indifference curve. Here are two dots. The blue dot tells us that Mr. Mouse will not consume the left of that point on the budget constraint, while the purple dot tells us that he will not consume to the right of that point on the budget constraint. Why is that? Because Mr. Mouse prefers his prior bundle to these bundles, even though he has new bundles available that offer him more cheese and apples than the prior bundle. As a result, there is no way he's going there. This leaves us all the points between the blue and purple dots as possible bundles. We can see by drawing these lines that some of these points involve less consumption of one of the products following the increase in income, if they are chosen. When Mr. Mouse buys less of something, when his income goes up, it is called an inferior good, while if he buys more of something when his income goes up, it is called a normal good. The brown line represents choices where cheese is an inferior good and apples are a normal good. The yellow line represents choices where both cheese and apples are normal goods. And finally, the black line represents choices where apples are an inferior good and cheese is a normal good. Ultimately, one of the goods has to be a normal good, as otherwise we would be saying that the individual wants to consume less of everything when their income goes up. Inferior goods are typically things where there is a substitute that is more expensive and seen as higher quality. A handbag from the warehouse versus a Louis Vuitton bag is one example, where the warehouse bag is an inferior good, i.e., as my income rises, I would substitute away from buying a warehouse handbag to a Louis Vuitton one. Okay, well, chatting with Mr. Mouse, it's clear that he views both cheese and apples as normal goods, but he's a bit concerned about price changes. For this, I will hand it over to Matty.
Thanks, Gulnara, and I'll get rid of that bag so you don't get any funny ideas. As already noted, price changes are strongly related to changes in income, with the change and the opportunity set available to the individual an important element of this. Now, for thinking about price change, I'm only going to think about one thing here. We're going to think alone, in this case, about cheese. So as you can see on the graph, we've just shown the amount of cheese that Mr. Mouse would select given that budget constraint and that indifference curve. Now, unlike a strict change in money income, if a single price changes, then even if the original bundle was available, the person may make a different choice. So Gulnara pointed out before that if money income's doubled and price is doubled, you would actually end up back where you were. One of those was an increase in income, another one was a reduction in the income, And so when your budget constraint went back to what it was, the choice that occurred was exactly the same. You don't get that with a price change. Now let's work through this, and specifically hope we can help guide Mr. Mouse through this. Now, Mr. Mouse is making his choice given that there is a price of cheese of 10 cents. But suddenly, the cheese price halves. So it goes to 5 cents. Amazing. This leads our friend Mr. Mouse into a world of imagining walls of cheese and all the fever dreams he can experience while gouging himself in the most hedonistic manner possible. But let's calm ourselves down for a second and see if we can represent this on our diagram. Mr. Mouse has decided to run off there. That's all right. We'll carry on thinking about his choice for him, and he can just do whatever he wants. It's a little bit rude, but yeah, sure. Right, so here is his new budget constraint. If he was only buying cheese, he can now buy twice as much cheese. If he was only buying apples, he can buy just as many apples as before. Those are things we can tell, but we don't know what his new choice is. Another thing we can tell here is if he buys one slice of cheese, he now only needs to sacrifice one apple to do so, when before he needed to sacrifice 2. So the slope of the budget constraint changes, and we get this nice light blue budget constraint. The old choice exists within the opportunity set that he could have previously chosen. And as a result, this is also an increase in the real income of Mr. Mouse. So it's not a change in money income, which shifts out the curve in a parallel way, but because of the price change being a reduction in prices, the opportunity set is larger, and we think about that as a higher real income. Specifically, the higher real income here is due to the ability to generate higher utility, due to this new opportunity set. So our Mr. Mousey is on an indifference curve. He can now go to a higher indifference curve that's above this prior one, and therefore score a higher level of utility. Now, let's do a thought experiment. What happens if we only want to understand the effect of the change in the price of cheese relative to apples and get rid of this income effect, this higher utility? In this instance, we would want to keep the utility level fixed, which means we would want to think about a choice that occurs with the new relative price of apples and cheese, so the new slope of the budget constraint, but one that is selected on that indifference curve, that level of utility. Now we can do that by taking Mr. Mouse's income and reducing the money income until he is touching that indifference curve with his budget constraint. So let's do that. There we go. So we've dragged down Mr. Mouse's income. And I'm sorry about that, Mr. Mouse, but you're not here right now to defend yourself. And I swear, once you get back, I'll give you back the income. It's just for us to do a thought experiment. What we can see here is that because cheese is relatively cheaper than it was before, Mr. Mouse substitutes towards cheese and away from apples. This increases the consumption of cheese due to the decline in the relative price of cheese and is called the substitution effect. So that's what we get when we look at this pink line here. The substitution effect is a product of the shape of the indifference curve. As the new budget constraint is flatter, the tangency will occur further to the right of the indifference curve as the marginal rate of substitution declines as we move along the indifference curve. Now, to put this in English, at the point prior, okay, the first point that was chosen, a cheese slice cost twice as much as an apple. So it needed to give twice as much utility, that specific item, in order to be purchased. Ultimately, when maximizing utility, the person, Mr. Mouse, will be setting the utility per dollar equal between all the different items, the marginal utility. Now in this case, since cheese cost twice as much, the item needed to give twice as much utility to have the same utility per dollar. Now that the price of cheese has fallen, we know at that point that the utility per dollar of cheese is much higher, the marginal utility. And as a result, he'll want to get more cheese, and he'll be willing to sacrifice apples to do so. This will keep happening, and as he has fewer apples in his bundle, he will get a higher marginal utility of apples. As he has more cheese, there will be a lower marginal utility of cheese, and this will keep going until the marginal utility of cheese and apples is the same, such that the marginal utility per dollar is the same for both again. So in that way, it makes a lot of sense that the substitution occurs. Given that logic, the substitution effect is always in this direction. It always leads to, if something has become relatively cheaper, more of it is purchased. As a result, a lower price will lead to more of a product being purchased due to the substitution effect always. However, this does not mean that a lower price will always lead to more being purchased. This is because we haven't thought about income effects. Now, if we compare this green line, which is hypothetical, with the blue line, we can see that that is solely an increase in income of the form Golnara was just talking about. If cheese was an inferior good, then this would lead to less cheese being purchased following the price change than the substitution effect indicated. In fact, if the income effect was large enough, we might end up in a situation where the person, in this case Mr. Mouse, ends up buying less cheese after the price of cheese falls. Now, I'm going to leave these Giffen goods to the side for now, but they might be an interesting topic for the future. Why is that? Mr. Mouse already told us that cheese is a normal good, so why we even think about it? We can go and we can look at the point he selects, which is over here, and we can see that is to the right of the substitution effect, because cheese is a normal good. With our income and substitution effects solved, we're finally ready to discuss Mr. Mouse's choice of cheese as prices change. Now for that, we need a whole new diagram. So there it goes. We have price on the vertical axis and the quantity of cheese on the horizontal axis. Now, let's go and draw our prices in and work out what quantities were associated with them. So we had a price of cheese of 10 cents, and we had a quantity that was that pink line there. We had a price of cheese at 5 cents and a quantity that's determined there. We can go and we can draw these two little dots that represent those price and quantity combinations, and we can see them on our diagram. Now, we're going to sit down and do this an infinite number of times, or we can be lazy and just draw a straight line between them, which is what I'm going to do here. Bam! Here is Mr. Mouse's demand curve for cheese, which is nicely the same color as cheese. This individual level demand curve tells us how much cheese he will purchase at different prices for cheese. His money income here is fixed. His preferences are fixed. The price of apples is fixed. It is only the price of cheese that varies in this diagram. Cool. Right, okay, now Mr. Mouse is back and he's feeling pretty chippy. He's jumping around the place. He just told me he's gone and loaded up on cheese based on the excited fever dreams that we brought up before. Okay, I mean, that's weird, but he seems happy. And we haven't wasted our time because we got to think about demand curves. Congratulations to us. Oh, wait a second. Mr. Mouse is tapping me on the shoulder. He's telling me the excitement's ebbed. He's not sure that he should have just gone and bought all that cheese without really thinking, especially when we've given him all this excellent advice beforehand. He's now wondering, is there some way he can exchange some of the cheese, in the same way that he exchanged the dollar coin before, in order to get some variety in his diet? Well, you know, that's something we want to help him with, but we've run out of time now, so we're going to have to help him in the next video. We look forward to seeing you all there, and have fun. Bye-bye.